We're going to talk today a little bit about the Virgin Mary, and I guess kind of what I would say, some things about her life. Most of it's kind of conjecture. Mary was probably born in Jerusalem. There's a church there that commemorates her birth, but it's her friendship with Saint Elizabeth when she goes to Jerusalem to see Elizabeth about the birth of the child. She probably was raised in that area to have such a close relationship with Elizabeth. And Elizabeth lived in a place called Ein Karin, which in that day was a village outside Jerusalem. Today it's within the borders of the city of Jerusalem itself. So Mary is probably born there, probably married at about 15, which was the normal age then. We see her in the community of the apostles at Pentecost, and several times when Jesus is teaching, she's present. She's also present at the crucifixion. But that's basically what we have. Mary is not a focus in the scriptures. The scriptures obviously are focusing on Jesus Christ. The first time we really come to something to do with Mary is in the year 431. Okay, now look at 431 years later. What happens? Well, the church has gotten its freedom. And so when the church has its freedom under Constantine, the first issue the church has to decide is whether or not Jesus is God. The church in general held the divinity of Jesus, but there were some theologians beginning to question it. In 431, the church held this council at Ephesus, and they're basically discussing who Jesus is. Before this period in the church, before we got our freedom under Constantine, our whole concern was the persecutions. But now the persecutions are over, so we can begin to look at some issues. And Jesus was generally held to be divine by the community, but some began to question it. So they had the council at Ephesus. The clear definition of Ephesus was that Jesus is as divine as God the Father, and he is as human as Adam. And how this works together, theologians will discuss for the rest of church history. But the definition was really clear. One of the things the church fathers began to question was the relationship of Mary. And they questioned it because the fathers at the council could see that Mary was, of course, the mother of the human Jesus, the mother of Jesus the man. But they questioned whether Mary could be the mother of the divine Jesus. And so theologians and philosophers began to discuss that way. And I think you know the way normal people think. We would look at it and say, if she's the mother of Jesus and Jesus is God, she's the mother of God. You can't be mother of just part of a person, that sort of thing. And so this discussion went on. But because Mary had lived in Ephesus, there was a great devotion to Mary in Ephesus, and their devotion to Mary was under the title Maria Theotokos, Mary, Mother of God. So that was the focus of their devotion. And when the fathers of the council began to discuss one way or another, the people were, let's say, less than pleased. And there seemed to be some danger to the people at the council. So they wisely decided that Mary was the mother of God. And then everyone went home. The key thing to this, though, is that on getting home, not a single bishop countermanded what he'd said at Ephesus. So it stood. If one or two had said, no, I did it just under threat, it would have changed the thing. But anyway, if you've ever been to Rome, one of the big churches in Rome, one of the basilicas is called St. Mary Major. And when you deal in these terms, the term major or greater means it's the first. And that is the first church built to Mary in the West. And the cornerstone of that church was laid the day the news from the Council of Ephesus arrived in Rome. And the name of that church is actually Maria Theotokos, Mary, the Mother of God. And from that point on, devotion to Mary spread very strongly in the church. And if you watch history, I think there's certain things that bring it about. in the period that we know as Romanticism, they looked a lot at the family life of Jesus very romantically, and interest in Mary really grew greatly. At the time, much earlier, when they were looking at, people were living under kings and that sort of thing, it became obvious that if you knew the mother of the king, you had an in that was very different than a political in. So Mary, as the mother of God, became very, very important as a point of intercession and stuff like that. But we've watched this sort of grow one way or another in the church. The next thing that happened is the reference to the virginity. I personally do not know if it has ever been declared a doctrine. I know it is a doctrine in the church, and it's fully and completely attested to by Matthew and Mark. Matthew deals with the whole story of the birth of Jesus from the point of view of Joseph, and Joseph's knowledge that he is not responsible for the child, and his knowledge that Mary is obviously pregnant. This becomes a conflict for Joseph in Matthew's account until the angel comes and explains it to him in the dream. In Luke's account, we actually have the angel coming to Mary and saying that she will give birth to Jesus and there is not to be a human father. That's very clear. So Mary's virginity then grew powerfully in the church. The next thing that occurred, there were a lot of studies about I think one of the things to know about the Catholic Church is we do not define a doctrine until someone denies it. So like you could say in general, everyone in the church believed Jesus was God. But when a theologian started questioning it, then they had the council, okay? So Mary's position was pretty well held all the way through. And in the early 1800s, the feast that we know as the Immaculate Conception, that feast existed in the Catholic Church from the 7th century, that Mary was conceived without sin. However, in the early 1800s, people began to question, how could she be a human being and not have sin? And so they began to look at it theologically, and it went on for quite a while. The key to the issue was discovered in what the angel says to Mary. When the angel comes to Mary, Angel Gabriel in Luke's account, the angel will say, "Hail, full of grace." The term there that's used for full is a term in Greek, that, like for instance, if you have some baby that's born as an absolutely gorgeous baby, beautiful little child, lovely young woman, you could say that woman's full of beauty. However, if you have a child that looks normal, and a young girl who looks very gangly and grows into a beauty, you cannot use that term full. You can say she's beautiful, but you cannot say the term full, because the term full in Greek has to do with time. And so when the angel said, "Hail Mary, full of grace," he was saying that Mary always had grace. And we believe that grace and sin are exclusive, so that when I sin, I drive grace out of my life. And when I receive grace, it drives sin out of my life. That's why forgiveness is connected with a sacrament. When you receive grace, that's what forces sinfulness out. So if Mary was full of grace, Mary was in fact without sin for her whole life. And as a result of that, in the year 1854, the Catholic Church declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Mary was immaculately conceived. Curiously, a feast that is even older than the Immaculate Conception is the Dormition, which we call in English the Assumption. The term Dormition is a Greek word, and it can be used for two things. It can be used to fall asleep, to go to sleep, and it can be used to die. Okay, one of the curiosities, if you study language, in every language, we have ways of speaking of death that are kinder. So you don't say someone died, you say they passed away. We have all kinds of ways of doing it. But anyway, Dormition is one of the ways you do it in Greek, which could be fell asleep, you know. And so this term, the Feast of the Dormition of Mary, was understood that at the end of her life, Mary was assumed into heaven, taken into heaven. The title of the feast was the Dormition. Again, you don't find any of this in the Bible. You can't able to deal with this biblically at all. But the curious thing is that when you look at Scripture, it is very clear in Scripture that death is a punishment for sin. Now you ask, well, then why would Jesus die? There's no sin in the life of Jesus. Well, the fact of the matter is Jesus chose to die. It doesn't come upon him as a penalty for anything. Jesus chose to come among us and die for us. Mary did not choose to die. There's no instance of that anywhere in the Scriptures, and she's without sin. So there doesn't really seem to be much reason for her to die. Theologians today discuss whether or not she actually died. But the corruption of the body is one of the major things that comes as a result of sin. And so Mary's body was taken into heaven after her falling asleep or dying. Again, whether or not Mary died, I think theologians discuss. But once the Immaculate Conception, which is seen biblically, can be established, then the Assumption of Mary followed. And the Assumption of Mary was declared in 1950. And I think Pius XII was the one who declared the doctrine. And that became a dogma of the faith. When we look at Mary, as Mary is seen today, the role of Mary as one who prays with the Church, at the Second Vatican Council, they made the central title of Mary for the Council is Mary, Mother of the Church. And when we look back biblically and we see, for instance, Mary given into the care of John, simultaneously, John is given into the care of Mary. It's given simultaneously. And in the tradition of the Church, John seems to be about the only apostle who's there at the cross when Jesus dies. So in a sense, John represents the Church there. And so Mary is given into the care of the Church, and the care of the Church is given into Mary, so that Mary intercedes for the Church, Mary prays for the Church, this sort of thing. One of the really important things to know about Mary, that in the Catholic Church, we speak of three kinds of prayer. One is called Dulia, and which is the prayer that you and I make, and the way we honor saints and stuff like that. The second one is called Hyperdulia, and Hyperdulia is the devotion to Mary. It's higher than the devotion with regards to any of the saints. And in Catholic tradition, a Catholic really needs to have something of devotion to Mary, okay? I think each of us peculiarly have devotion to our own saints and that sort of stuff. But it's almost indigenous to the Catholic Church that you have some devotion to Mary. And the third level of prayer, I can't remember it now, but it's only due to God. Only God gets the third level. But Mary has this hyperdulia. And I think it's amazing to see the evolution historically as how Mary is used. Right now in church history, I would say that Mary is considered one of the examples of a woman who made it. So that Mary's very strong for people in the women's movement and stuff like that. And they see Mary as a very committed woman who stood by her son and what he went through and carried him on, has this position in the church. And so that's kind of how we see Mary today. It was interesting when I was ordained. I've mentioned this story before. When I was expelled from the seminary, I began saying the rosary twice a day. Before that, I said it once a day, asking that I could end up a priest. And when I finally gave up applying to places. I came home one day, and in the mailbox was a letter addressed to me inviting me to join a seminary I had not applied to, and it was for the Society of Mary. So I've always seen that as a powerful thing with regards to intercession. And after I was ordained, I decided that I would travel to Ephesus and I would say a massive celebration for ordination in the home of Mary. The little place where she is supposed to have lived still exists in Ephesus. It's outside the city, and it's a site you can visit. Mary is as important in the Muslim community as she is in the Catholic community. So there are lots and lots of pilgrims there, both Muslim and Christian, because it's a Muslim country. But when I look back, one of the things that strikes me is that when I decided to celebrate with regards to Mary, it never occurred to me to go to Lourdes or Fatima. That I find that the whole stories of the apparitions and stuff like that are not too significant to me. But the role of Mary, particularly in reference to Jesus and to the Church, is very, very significant. It's probably true that each Catholic finds their own mode of devotion.